Good morning, everybody. I wish I brought a poem of my own after that. So I'd like to speak to you today about why you're all here today, human trafficking. But I'd like to speak about what's going on around us in suburbs, just a few k's away from this suburb. And I think the best way to do that is to take you on a bit of a journey. It's my personal journey as to how I discovered what's going on in Melbourne, in Sydney, all over Australia. Not really even that hidden. You just have to have eyes and a car and you'll see signs of a very, very insidious organised crime trade going on about us. So about 4 years ago, I've been seeing stuff on CNN about human trafficking. I'd seen a film, I think, called, it was quite a famous film, won an award. It was about human trafficking, that's the one. And I thought to myself, people are saying it's happening in Australia, but we're not seeing this at all. But when I walk out of my door in Thornbury and I get in my car and drive down High Street in Northcote or through Preston, there's all these little massage parlours that say Asian massage. They have red lights, they look dodgy as one could imagine. They look to me like illegal brothels. And they seem to be highlighting the fact that they're serving an Asian massage. There's Asian women inside. Now, if Asia is the home of human trafficking, perhaps number one, that would be the first home, Eastern Europe being the second, are there trafficked women in these brothels? Now, I call them brothels, they call them massage parlours, but most of them are illegal brothels. But the first thing that occurred to me is if they are illegal brothels, why are they there at all? What's going on? How can somebody run a business that so obviously to somebody with no knowledge at all looks like an illegal brothel and get away with it? Who's responsible for this issue? Is it the Victoria Police? Surely the cops are in charge of shutting down illegal pimps. That would make sense. We've all heard about vice squads and these sorts of things. I was quite shocked to learn that it's actually local council officers. So local council's in charge of picking up your rubbish and sets the rates of your bills and all those sorts of things. If you've ever tried to get your local council to do anything, you know how difficult it is to get them to do a simple thing like pick up some hard rubbish. So it struck me as odd that this is the entity that's in charge of policing these illegal brothels. The reason they're in charge of, at that time, of policing illegal brothels was because under planning laws, it's illegal to run a brothel without a licence. So the idea being that your local council will go in and say, if you're selling sex here, you're breaking a local council law, which sounds to me absolutely ridiculous. There's a far deeper crime going on here, but that's the way the state of Victoria chose to look at the problem. And the reason they chose to look at the problem like this was because 25 years ago, we did have a vice squad in Melbourne, a bunch of detectives whose job it was to crack down on illegal bookmaking and illegal brothels, crack down on vice. The problem was that they started to get involved in vice themselves. They were getting kickbacks from illegal bookmakers. They were using the prostitutes themselves. They became corrupted. So they took the power away from the police and they gave it to local councils. That was a core reason. They broke up the police's ability to look at this sort of problem, which was a huge problem in and of itself because, yes, there were some bad apples, but they weren't all bad apples. And a good policeman is worth his weight in gold, as we'll get to a bit later. So on my mission to look at these brothels, I just saw a little article about a local council that had been raided by the cops over a bribery investigation that was linked to a massage parlour. I thought, what the hell has gone on here? It was in Richmond, and it was the Yarra Council. Did a bit of calling around, and I discovered that a Yarra Council officer whose job it was to crack down on these brothels using the planning laws had been suspended. So I wrote him a letter, and it was a bit of a bluff by myself. I said to him, I know why you've been suspended, and I had some whispers. I knew a bit about it, but not all the story. But basically, I know you've been taking bribes from local illegal Asian massage parlour brothel owners, and as a result of taking those bribes, you're keeping these brothels open. Now, I want to tell this story, and I can tell it about you with your help, or I can tell it about you without your help. But you give me your help, and you can help tell the story yourself. You can tell your own story. There's some redemption in this for you. The redemption being that every human being, pure evil doesn't really exist. There's evil and there's good in everybody. But even the worst, people like this guy who do the wrong thing most certainly, he was letting these illegal brothels flourish. There there's probably a good reason why he was doing that. Not something that would justify his actions, but something that, a driver. And sure enough, he was a gambler. So I met him at a cafe out out near Cranbourne Way, and he just looked like he was a picture of the most pathetic human being I'd ever seen. He was overweight, big moustache. He was defeated, smoking a million miles an hour. He knew the cops were going to charge him for taking bribes. But I gave him, I guess, a bit of a glimmer of redemption in that I said to him, number one, admit what you've done and say why you've done it, gambling. But number two, help me expose what's been going on inside these places. And he really warmed up to that. He said, listen, Nick, I know perhaps more than any other council officer in this state which organised crime figures are running which brothels, illegal brothels, and what's going on. Now, I don't have all the answers. I haven't got police phones. Perhaps I'm just a local council officer, but I can tell you that there's a network of entrenched, mostly Asian organised crime figures running a whole bunch of brothels in the Yarra area. And with his information, it was like a key. There were names and there was addresses and there was locations and dates of birth, these sorts of things. And I began to search behind these illegal brothel owners. We did a big story in The Age saying, I think it was dozens and dozens of illegal brothels running in broad daylight, no one doing anything. There's one local council officer who's been taking bribes not to shut them down. How is this going on? Now, a day or two after I wrote that story, I got a very short email to my inbox, and it simply said, Nick, you're on the right track, but you're not close to the truth. You've got to look at the murder. Sorry, not the murder, the death. The death of a young man outside a South Melbourne brothel. It's a legal brothel. It was an Asian, specialising in Asian women. It's all the emails said. So I just Googled death, brothel, killing, South Melbourne. One article came up. It was an in-brief article. Didn't have any name in it. It just said a young man's been killed after a robbery. He's been killed outside a brothel. Didn't quite make sense to me. I wanted to find out more. If there'd been a death outside, even as a robbery, where was the investigation? Most people don't get killed after performing a robbery, let alone a robbery outside a brothel. So I scurried around and found this guy's name, Papo. That was his last name. First name was Abraham. In fact, it might be worth bringing up a photo of Abraham now. Abraham, that's Abraham Papo. So he was about 24, 25. He died outside this South Melbourne brothel. Simply put his name into Google, found out where his parents lived. They lived in Blackburn, around the corner from just here, and went very suspicious when they picked up the phone. They said, what do you want? It's been a year since Abraham had died. And straight away, his mother, was almost bawling in tears on the phone. But she said, I've been waiting for a phone call like yours. Now, his mother was actually a very religious woman. She's Jewish, but she also has a strong affinity to the Christian faith as well. And she saw me as an omen, sort of like an angel, a guardian angel, in fact. I think she actually thought I was a bit like her son Abraham. So she said, come to my house. And she welcomed me in with her partner. I'll never forget, they opened the door, and what I saw was that photo of Abraham. It was much bigger than that. It was big as the whole screen there. The first thing you saw when you entered this house was the photo of their young dead son. And they took me past his room, and they said, have a look inside. And the room was left as it had been when Abraham had walked out 1 year before and said, Mum and Dad, I love you. I've got to go sort something out. So he had a picture of Bruce Lee on the wall. He had a poster of a girl in a bikini. He had some plastic nunchucks over the door handle. It was a single bed with like a Spider-Man sort of doona on it. It was like a teenager's bedroom. I mean, he was basically he was probably a teenager who had never grown up. He was 23, 24. I said to him, what on earth happened to Abraham? And then they told me a story about Abraham meeting a girl, an Asian girl, a Korean girl, who they got to know because she was studying English, and to be studying English on the floor of their home in Blackburn. Now, they didn't know what she did as a job. They were quite naive. Maybe they did know what she did, but they didn't really want to look under too many rocks. But they said Abraham died because he was helping this girl. You got to speak to Abraham's brother. He knows more about this. So I called up Abraham's brother, and he flew down from Queensland, and he met me, and he said, listen, Nick, this girl was a Korean prostitute. Abraham had met her at this South Melbourne brothel some months beforehand. He'd fallen in love with this Korean prostitute. He wanted to be with her, and she got into trouble. And all the brother said to me, what happened was, I was with Abraham. Abraham said to me, she's been kidnapped and moved to another brothel from Melbourne to Sydney. She's getting abused, she's getting held against her will, and she needs my help. Now I need $5,000 in cash. and I need you to give it to me, and don't ask why. And being a brother, he got out $5,000, gave it to him in cash. He said to Abraham, go to the local cops. Abraham said, he went to the police in Nunawading and filed a missing persons report and said, my girlfriend has gone missing. She's a prostitute. She's been moved to Sydney, and the cops did nothing. And maybe they thought, mate, you're going out with a prostitute, an Asian prostitute. Who cares? She's gone to Sydney. She's working at the brothel. She's broken your heart. Big deal. So Abraham took matters into his own hands. Now, all we know is that he said to his brother, I'm going to go to the brothel and sort things out. And he kissed his mum on the cheek and said, Mum, he didn't tell her what he was doing, but Mum, I love you. I'll see you in the morning. Good night. Never ever saw his mother again. In fact, the next time his mother saw him, his body was lying, still makes me emotional to this day, lying passed out in the morgue, as you'd imagine. And it wasn't just a normal morgue body. It was a body that was battered beyond belief. Now, this was a clue. So one of the things I did was I looked at all those sort of facts that I've told you and said, this is not a robbery. This is not a robbery. And one of the things that gave me that belief was not just the fact that he told his brother that he was saving his girlfriend who was working the brothel and she'd been kidnapped. $5,000, he got $5,000 in cash. Why would somebody with $5,000 in cash feel the need to commit a robbery, to rob a brothel? He had $5,000. Didn't make sense. The state of his body at that morgue, I got the pathology report which the parents had. Now the pathologist had described the injuries. Now this is full on, so bear with me here. But basically it was like the body had been in a car wreck. It was that badly battered. There was collapsed lungs, there was a fractured skull, there were broken bones. This is a man who'd been beaten to a pulp, beaten to his death. Why the hell hadn't there been a homicide investigation? Why wasn't there a sex trafficking investigation? What had gone on here? So I called up the policeman involved in this situation. He was extraordinarily helpful, a good detective. I think he was a detective in a rush as well. He was probably a fairly hurried person, and he got to the scene of the crime, and the guy who had killed him was an Asian guy working in the brothel, and he'd said Abraham had come in and tried to steal some phones. There's a confrontation, no mention about a girlfriend, a confrontation. He'd run out of the brothel. This guy had followed him out of the brothel. Abraham had run to his car with these phones from the brothel, got in his car, grabbed a metal tyre lever, confronted the guy. The Asian guy grabbed the metal tyre lever and began to beat him to death. Abraham had got back into his car, tried to drive away. The attack continued as this guy was trying to drive away. Now, the policeman said, yes, it's suspicious. And yes, this brothel is probably linked to organised crime, although I can't tell you how or why. But because Abraham has done this thing, he's gone in there, he's been aggressive, he's taken the phones, it's a robbery, therefore the guys chased him. Abraham's grabbed a metal bar, this is self-defence, the guys grabbed the bar. Yeah, it stinks to high heaven, but we don't have enough to charge this guy with murder. But even that explanation didn't ring true to me. So if it was just a robbery, surely just pick up the phone and call the police. Call your mobile phone. He had a mobile phone. Why would anybody in this day and age steal a landline from a brothel? You've got to be serious. He had $5,000 in his car. Now, if it truly was a robbery and he wanted to report it to the police, why did he need to keep attacking Abraham as Abraham drove away? He was getting away in his own car. Take the number plate, call the cops, they can go and arrest him and charge him with burglary, fine. But no, this man didn't just beat Abraham, he beat him to a pulp, he beat him to death. He wanted to silence him. Abraham knew something that was going on in that brothel, and that man wanted to make sure that Abraham never ever told anybody. So I started to do some checks on this man, and very quickly I discovered a very, very ugly picture. This bloke, by putting his name into court systems in New South Wales, South Australia and Queensland, he'd been charged in 3 states with offences relating to sex trafficking or human trafficking or illegal prostitution. And as he was charged, sometimes he'd beat those charges, he'd move to another state and start his business again. He was an enforcer. He was a big guy. He was working, he wasn't the main man, but he was working for an illegal human trafficking syndicate. What told me that? Well, the fact that he was, wherever he went, he was charged with in Adelaide, he was charged with, it was something like keeping a slave. There's some sort of old law there. It was a sex slave. How on earth was this guy working in a legal brothel in Melbourne? How on earth had this guy beaten someone That's him on the left-hand side there. And how had there not been a murder investigation, a proper murder investigation? So we put all these facts in our story in The Age. It was a front-page story, and the image on the front page was of Abraham's parents holding a photo of him. And when you opened the paper, you had that photo you saw of Abraham bang right in your face. And we laid out all the facts. The fact that the guy who had killed him was someone involved in human trafficking, the fact that Abraham had told his brother he was rescuing his girlfriend, the fact that his girlfriend was stuck in a Sydney brothel. Now, other police later told us that she had been taken to a brothel against her will, and she was actually working off a debt of some sort. So she was in trouble, and he'd gone to help her. Now, he didn't do it the right way. You don't run into a brothel. But I guess a guy at the end of his tether who's gone to the local police and complained about it, what are his options? Now, underneath all this is a message of a failure of law enforcement to do its job. There was something really, really sinister going on here, and no one had bothered to pick up more than one or two rocks. Why not? So we laid out some of this picture as best we could in the paper. And as a result of that, the coroner that was looking at the case, the coroner had planned for a 15-minute hearing into the death of Abraham Papo. Most deaths, unusual deaths, get very little time in this state. In fact, there's a backlog in the coroner's court of hundreds of deaths. The coroner said, I'm not going to do this 15-minute inquiry. There's more to this story. I'm going to send this back to the homicide squad, and they're going to do a proper job. And it went to a cop who was far more thorough and dedicated than that first cop. In fact, he was an arson detective who had been investigating fires in brothels linked to human trafficking, so he knew the picture. And he got into this with both hands, and he said, this the last thing I do, I'm going to get to the bottom of what's happened here. And about 6 months after that, I got a phone call that said, Nick, just send a photographer to a police station in Nunawading, which we did at 6 a.m. And the photo we got was that photo. And that was the detective from the arson squad there arresting the man for murder next to him, charging him with murder, the murder of Abraham Papo. Now, the story gets a lot deeper than this. And the police, and this never came out in court, but as part of our investigation, we then went to... This was the start now of another investigation. What was going on in these brothels? So we went to Korea, and the Korean authority said, those brothels that this guy has been working for, we've been monitoring them for years, and we reckon that 150 Korean women have been sent to Australia, and many of them have been going through these 2 or 3 brothels in South Melbourne and 2 or 3 brothels in Sydney that are all run by the same syndicate. Now, 6 months after that, the AFP charged 2 or 3 people, mid-level people, with human trafficking in connection to this syndicate that was operating, and which had led to which Abraham Papo, he'd found a human trafficking syndicate. He confronted it, and they tried to silence him. That's what had happened to Abraham Papo. The story doesn't end well, though. Unfortunately, the charges against that chap, after he was committed to trial, and then the actual trial, the case collapsed. For legal, technical reasons. It was a complicated case, and unfortunately our justice system is not perfect, but there just wasn't enough evidence for the judge to instruct the jury to take the case seriously and to convict. And that man walked away not only with murder, but he walked away with human trafficking. Now, how many lives had that person ruined? Well, I know for a fact he was keeping 12 to 13 women in an apartment in Melbourne CBD as sex slaves, and he would be sending them to different brothels, and they'd be working, and it was like a jail. And he would threaten those women, and they gave statements to the police, but of course they were scared. One of the big weaknesses in the human trafficking case that the AFP lodged against people he was working for as an enforcer was these women aren't great witnesses, because human trafficking is complicated. Sometimes they work one of them was, for instance, she was working as a stripper in Asia. You might have a judgment on strippers or not, but so what? She did not deserve to be trafficked. Yet, because she'd been in this, what some would see as an insidious profession, stripping, she could be attacked as a witness. Oh, hang on, you do that, you've done that in Asia, so surely you wanted to work as a prostitute here. Why should we not believe that? So she didn't speak English. Had to go through a translator, and of course there's fear. These women are scared. So they know if they testify, the trafficking syndicate from their home country, from Korea or from Thailand or from Burma, they know where their family is. There's this huge threat of fear that prevents witnesses from telling the truth in the fashion that we wish they would. So that case, the AFP case, partly collapsed as well, unfortunately. So what are we left with here? Is a picture of our state, Australia, our criminal justice system, our local councils, our cops, struggling to deal with this problem in the way we'd like to see them deal with it. And today, the women running those brothels that Abraham Papo's girlfriend worked in are still running these brothels. And I guarantee you, there's still women from Asia being sent to these brothels. And there's well-meaning detectives like that one in the photo who are trying to do their best against a system that's really not set up to help or save or prevent people of this horrible trade and to help people stuck in it. So what do we do? Well, my role as a journalist, number one, is to expose it, to do things like this today, but also to put in the paper and to keep the pressure on. And I guarantee you, cops hate picking up papers and reading articles about their stuffed up investigations. And that's one thing we can do, but there's plenty of other things that advocates or people who care about this problem can do as well. And I'm one person, but there's a lot of people in this room who could all do their own little thing. And let me give you a little suggestion or story. So there's a bunch of nuns, Catholic nuns, who I've met with once or twice. They're older ladies, and they're probably 60s and 70s, and they're nice. Don't get me wrong, I like a bicky and a cup of tea. And they talk about human trafficking, and they write to ministers, and they're very deferential. So when they meet an MP, so an MP might, they hassle the MP for 6 months, and the local politician comes out, and probably only comes out because he knows that there's a big Catholic vote. So you've got to keep the nuns on side. He says some nice things, and they have a bicky and a cup of tea. And I said to these nuns, go to the brothel. It's called the Candy Club. It's on Victoria Street in Richmond. You go there, get a big bunch of nuns, get in the habit, get 50 of you together, I'll get the cameras there, and you protest outside that brothel. And every man walking, well, there's no man going to be walking to that brothel, I guarantee you, when you're out there. But you're going to be sending a message that you and the Catholic Church don't like what's going on. And why is this brothel, which has hosted sex slaves, still open, still licensed? Forget the illegal brothels. I mean, this is happening in licensed brothels licensed by the state. Now, the nuns weren't up for that, but I only say it as an example of sometimes the way to fight these sorts of things is through a bit more of a radical approach. You can do all the obvious things, I think, which is writing to your MP and talking and discussing and pushing journalists and all those sorts of things. But I actually think to confront this problem, you've got to be radical. You've got to really think about how you can explode things in the news and get in people's faces and get the cops to do their job and hassle and push. And everybody in this room knows somebody in a position of power somewhere. You might have a cousin who's an MP or a brother who's a senior cop or whatever the case may be. Get in their ear and ask them about it and say, what's going on? And push. Why can't we make human trafficking as big an issue as so many other issues that people protest about in this country? And certainly there's very little discussion about it now. I mean, if you can bring back the photo of Abraham Papo, there's something of Abraham. There's something really sad about Australia, and that is that if you're Asian, if you're a prostitute, if you don't speak English, you've got no political agency, you've got no voice, you don't even vote. Who are you going to complain to? But if you're white and you're blonde and you've got blue eyes and you're from the suburbs, then unfortunately, but people can connect to you. And the reason this story took off is because Abraham was a victim that people could identify with. So one of our challenges is to make our community care about the women involved in this situation, give them a voice, and it's through people like yourselves that you can give women a voice. You almost have to speak for them, because if they have the courage to speak, they may not be listened to. And it's a really sad reality, but also it should be a real prompt to fight for change as well. So I'm really happy to take some questions, and don't be shy.
Thank you, Nick.